Welcome to The Riff, where writer and investor Byrne Hobart and I discuss the major inflection points caused by technological change. Our weekly conversation covers the obvious and not so obvious ways in which markets and businesses will adapt as a result. Let's jump right in.
Hey, Byrne.
Hey, you ready?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
All good.
Okay, great. Let's start with what's going on in the EU right now. You just covered it today. Can the EU compete? Why don't you unpack what you were saying in that post?
Yeah, absolutely. So usually the answer to what's going on in the EU in tech is either like very little or like someone is getting fined. And then there are these islands of really high productivity. So things like ASML and, very strong aerospace sector, but like a lot of the narrative about Europe's tech economy has correctly pointed out that there just have been far fewer startups, that the startup ecosystem of people who are born in Europe and move to the US to start a company is just a lot more robust and exciting and high market cap, et cetera. And so the EU recently put out a report that actually addressed a lot of this, or didn't address a lot of it comprehensively, and was focused more on strategic industries, more on manufacturing and the like. But it was an attempt to take seriously the idea that European countries are underperforming, particularly with respect to tech, that slow growth adds up over time. So I think it was like 15 years ago, the US and the current EU nations were contributing roughly the same amount to global GDP. And if you look at it today, there's been quite a divergence. So used to be they were both like 21% of global GDP. Now the US is about 26%, and those EU countries are about 18%. So there's been a sort of share shift in economic activity. And that is the accumulation of many years of the US growth being, half a point or a point higher. It does add up over time. And I think one of the interesting things in the report was that it's actually quite pragmatic. So sometimes when people are talking about what should the state do to increase technological capabilities and allow energy abundance and things, like they move directly to things that will be an important part of the mix long term. So stuff like renewables, batteries, et cetera, reducing consumption. But what they skip over is the short term part, where there are a lot of industries that depend on cheap energy, depend on consistent supplies of energy, and we're not really in a position just as a species, as a civilization, to achieve that without using some fossil fuels. And so one of the things that this report talks about is, like, implicitly, one of the reasons that this economic relationship between US growth and European growth has flipped is that the US used to be the country that was basically like a large economy that was net short energy. We had to import a lot of energy, and that meant anytime there was geopolitical volatility, it was usually bad for the US. And that meant that if you were a global investor, you wouldn't necessarily you'd view the US government bonds as definitely the world's safe haven security. And that's very unlikely to change in my lifetime. But if you were looking at US equities, you wouldn't necessarily view the US as like the safest, most secure bet on long-term growth. But now that the US is basically energy independent and can export natural gas to the rest of the world, that relationship has flipped. And now Europe is the economic region where when things go a little crazy internationally, they're the ones who have the most direct economic hit. And I thought some of the policy proposals around that could happen, but kind of weak. So one of them was that, hey, if natural gas prices are really volatile, and if that makes it just really hard to underwrite long-term investments in manufacturing capacity, why don't we just get long-term fixed price contracts in natural gas? And I think there's a lot of people have had that concept in their heads and have tried to price it out. And it's just very expensive, because the higher the volatility is, the more you have to pay for certainty. But I think you could get something close to that effect, where you basically say that the governments are going to get together and provide some sort of buffer where they will insulate industries from the cost of much more expensive natural gas, and also those industries won't benefit as much from cheaper natural gas. But it does mean that if you are a German conglomerate, you're trying to decide, do I start this new fertilizer plant or not? Do I open this, do I keep this car manufacturing plant open, or do I shut it down? That you don't have to have this big uncertainty in your economic model, where if energy is cheap, this is a great investment. If energy is expensive, this is a ruinous investment, and we have no way to know and no way to hedge. So I thought that part was realistic. And I thought like a lot of a lot of the report was basically taking other EU bureaucrats to task and saying like a lot of the regulatory frameworks just don't make sense. Like sometimes the EU is one market, sometimes the EU is 27 different markets. But if you're worried about things like antitrust, like the EU has had this roaming arrangement for mobile phones where you can I think it's called like roam like you're at home or something like that. And it basically means that you can get phone service from whomever, and you're not going to pay. You don't have significantly worse economics if you don't get it from a mobile operator in your home country. And if that's the rule, then it really doesn't make sense to treat a merger that consolidates the mobile phone industry in one small country as being anti-competitive, because there is still, in fact, a lot of competition, and that's codified in law. So I think like the most salient part of the report from the perspective of what can happen now and what would an investor care about is that they were basically saying that there should be a lot of consolidation in mobile phone operators and in telcos generally, and that they don't think that other regulators should stand in the way of that. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But I mostly thought like it is good to see European officials talking seriously about growth, the challenges of growth, the fact that it's not easy and it's not cheap, but it does have to get done, because if it doesn't get done, if you have an aging continent that is rich enough that people are not desperate, it's very easy to end up in this trap where GDP per capita is still underperforming the rest of the world, and the continent is aging even more. So healthcare costs and pension costs make it harder to spend money on other things. And then you just end up with stasis, and other places leave the EU behind. So I thought it was actually a net exciting report. Then again, I'm not one of the bureaucrats being condemned for my short-sightedness, and I'm also not one of the people who has to actually put this into practice. But yeah, I thought it was good, because I have participated in jokes about Europe's economy, and I think they are getting kind of old. And it would be nice for those jokes to be just a dated, completely obsolete stereotype, in the same way that there are occasionally narratives about how the US foreign policy is determined by where the oil is and will always invade countries that have natural resources, but we don't really need to do that anymore. The frackers have mostly solved that. So just like that line of political commentary is basically obsolete today, it would be nice if the view that Europe is just going to systematically underperform the US in terms of economic growth, it'd be nice if that were obsolete too.
And it seems like the worse the growth is, the more they play up the sort of the degrowth stuff, or sort of the regulatory stuff. It's like, yeah, we're not a leader in innovation, but we're a leader in regulation. Or who needs growth anyway?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell how much of that is that the regulators do, like, it is just easier to block things than it is to make them happen. And if you don't have that much of a domestic AI industry, like they do have some AI companies, and actually some that punch well above their weight, but if your economic zone is not the main driver, not a major driver of the main kind of innovation that people are excited about, then it is easy to say, well, at least we have the best rules about how you can use this stuff. But what that ends up meaning is that you just have a lot of Europeans VPNing in to use American services because they get blocked in Europe or something like that. And when I visit European sites, there's just tons and tons of cookie pop-ups, and it feels like these were well-intentioned. And actually the report talks about this, like GDPR, very, very good intentions. It is nice to preserve people's privacy, but just giving them sort of red tape before they access websites when they just don't empirically care that much about privacy doesn't actually solve anything. It mostly inconveniences people, but it does, like, if you're responsible for that and you feel like that was a good thing, then every day, every time you browse a site or open an app, you do get to feel like you did something, you accomplished something. So, and I think the degrowth thing is kind of similar to that, where it's sort of like, if you look at the like economic growth, GDP per capita growth, and well, GDP per capita growth is going to be distorted by exchange rate fluctuations, but it is true that standards of living have improved in the US a lot faster than they've improved in the UK. And, you can look back at a decade or so of that and say, oh yeah, we actually meant to do that. Like we wanted our GDP per capita to be lower because we don't believe in endlessly rising consumption. But I don't know, degrowth, I'm hoping it's not all that popular. I'm hoping anyone who thinks about it seriously says it's just a terrible thing, because what they always end up doing is saying that they've picked the standard of living they have, and they think that is good enough, and that we should just focus on reducing the impact of that more and not making it better. And one of the questions for them is like, why did you pick this year? Like, why didn't you pick 1800? And if you were alive in 1800, would you have said like, this is actually pretty much fine? And, 50% or 50% childhood mortality rate that is gradually coming down. Like that's totally acceptable. We don't really need growth beyond that. I don't think so. I think people generally want their lives to be better. And people also just underestimate how much they will actually enjoy economic progress. And they also underestimate just how much they'll be used to whatever standard of living that they can achieve at a given level of inputs and really not want to dial it back. I noticed this with my kids where when I grew up, I had a refrigerator, there was a freezer, there's, a tray where you make ice cubes. And so there's one kind of ice cube, but my kids have grown up in a world where the fridge actually has a water dispenser and an ice cube dispenser. And you can get like cubes of ice, you can get crushed ice, you can also get spheres of ice, and they all have different preferences about what kind of ice they want. And they'll ask me for things like, can you give me a cup of water with some ice cubes and then some crushed ice on top? And to them, this is just like a normal thing to expect a refrigerator to be capable of doing, because but what they don't really recognize is like appliances have continuously improved over time. They're also getting more energy efficient over time. So the things that they view as just unquestionably, obviously a thing that should be available, that you should have access to no matter what, are things that were just not really available, not on anyone's radar. They were not like a list of desires that people had. It's just when companies invent new reasons to get someone to upgrade their refrigerator, they will add new features. Some of those features people tend to find appealing. And so it becomes weird to them to think that they would end up with a slightly worse refrigerator. So I'm not, I wouldn't like, immediately volunteer to join the military if I learned that our freedom to buy weirdly fancy ice dispensing refrigerators was being threatened somehow. But what I think it illustrates is that everyone sets this baseline expectation about standards of living pretty much based on what they grew up with, and then the things that they wanted that they couldn't afford as a kid but were able to buy as an adult. And it's just natural to view those as the things that people should want, and everything else as like some kind of weird preference and some kind of ludicrous form of conspicuous consumption. But we all just have different sets of preferences, and the only way that we can all achieve our individual mix of the weird stuff we happen to find appealing is for there to be such radical abundance that it's all affordable and it's all being manufactured at sufficient scale that you can just go out and buy it.
Yeah. So my other podcast co-hosts, Dan Romero and Antonio Garcia Martinez, have this long-standing feud where Dan will, make fun of it. And Antonio's kids live in France, and Antonio is a big fan of Europe, and Dan will just point to the GDP per capita, and Antonio will say, yeah, well, at least living in Europe is not living in San Francisco. It's not this dumpster fire. And so I guess I'm curious, why is Europe or some places at least better able to provision sort of government services despite having much less resources or much less capital to provide those services?
Yeah, so France does a really good job of that. Like they actually have a very competent government, and they are very selective with who gets to be a bureaucrat. And so like a lot of, and there is like this American tendency to make fun of how overregulated these countries are. But if you have a very regulated economy, but the regulators are actually really, really competent, and people who go into business, like at least some fraction of them did it because they could not cut it as a government bureaucrat, then the regulations will tend to make sense. And if you have that dynamic, then maybe you do actually want someone out there enumerating exactly what the 500 varieties of cheese are and how you define them and what counts as high quality and what is not, because you know that the B team is going to be actually making this stuff and selling it, and maybe you do actually need to threaten them with a fine for them to do a decent job. And I think that is like, you can have different equilibria there, and you can actually have a country that is robustly capitalist in the ways that count while still having a competent bureaucracy. I think Singapore is a really good example of that, where it, again, is a case where the really high status jobs and a lot of the really well-paying jobs are with the government, but you still have a private sector. It still works. It's just that private sector is operating within rules that are written by very smart people. Now, Singapore, it is a special case. Like I am a big fan of Singapore, but I also think that it's worth recognizing that Singapore is not a complete country. Like that model only really works if you do have just a hinterland, like a place where people are actually digging up raw materials, a place where they're manufacturing things. Singapore does a lot less of that, although they do some of it. And their actual economic function is to be like this central node for trade and finance. And so you can't just say that we're going to apply the Singapore model to, the entire United States. Like Montana as Singapore just doesn't make very much sense and doesn't really work. But I think certainly applying the part of that model where there are cases where McKinsey is trying to hire someone and the government is trying to hire someone and McKinsey doesn't get them because the government offered them more money. I think that's that's good because government is going to exist. It's going to be very hard to turn the U.S. into an anarcho-capitalist paradise. So in the meantime, you do have to have a government, and it's a really bad setup if the government has pretty unlimited scope in what it can do, or what it's allowed to do, and then very limited ability to actually execute on plans. Because you will, per the cookie pop-up discussion, you will have this focus on things that are just visible indications that somebody tried. I think like California is a fun example of this, where everything in California gives you cancer, apparently, and everything has a label indicating that it gives you cancer. And I'm sure whoever was originally responsible for that felt like they were actually doing the world a great service by warning them of potential carcinogens. But it's hard to craft a rule like that does not become a de facto rule of just slap the label on everything that contains physical materials of any kind, and then you're safe. And once a few people start doing that, then the equilibrium is just the label is everywhere. No one pays attention to it. There was a similar issue with, I think it was allergen labeling, where there was a set of stricter regulations on how careful you have to be if you have a facility that is making different kinds of foods, and some of them have allergens and some of them do not. And it actually, because the fine for not complying with really strict rules on separating the allergens and non-allergens was so high, it actually became a better deal to just add allergens to foods. And if you added allergens to foods, you could put them on the ingredients list, and then if someone has an allergy, they can't buy it. So, or they would know not to buy it. So that was what that ended up doing, was actually limiting the ability of people with food allergies to buy the foods that they liked, because now these foods have some unknown quantity of allergen. It's either like the minimum amount that you can put in it so that you are allowed to put it on the ingredients list, or it's like, hey, we weren't going to include this, but we know the set of customers who like it is large, the set of people with allergies is small. We might as well include it now that the cost of servicing the market for people with these food allergies is more expensive. So yeah, but then the meta problem you run into is that at any given time, there's just going to be a finite quantity of competent people, and you do want to sort them into the jobs where they can do the most good. And the US's implicit policy is that the vast majority of competent people should go into the private sector, and then they should periodically have made so much money and feel so guilty about how dysfunctional other parts of the country are that they retire and get senior jobs at government organizations. And then their problem is, like, they're used to running really, really functional, effective organizations. And one of the reasons those organizations work really well is that incompetent people can get fired. And so if you put them in charge of some group that has a much broader mandate, but a much weaker internal culture of caring about performance, then they just go crazy. So I think it is kind of, in some ways, it is a system that lets us recycle talent from the private sector into public service jobs. In another way, it is just like this scheme to periodically take someone who's very accomplished in the business world, send them to Washington, D.C., where they will be driven absolutely crazy, and then they will just retire in irritation and, hope that the country survives through the duration of their life. I suspect most of them don't think of it in quite so dramatic a set of terms, but I think that's sort of what ends up happening.
Are you sympathetic to the Javier Milei style rhetoric of, like, that people like Vivek and Trump, you sort of mimic to some extent of, like, Trump, of course, said drain the swamp, but that had a political tinge to it. But also just the sort of the bloat of these administrative institutions is way too big, and we need to just, like, start over, basically, or sort of, remove them. There's this famous clip where Milei is going through each and every department and saying, like, what do they do? Let's get rid of them, etc. Is that, like, is that net counterproductive to even be entertaining? That's what that Noah Smith would entertain that and say, hey, these roles actually serve a critical function. He thinks the problem is that we've outsourced too much of it to the nonprofit sector, and we actually need to bring it back into the government, where it's in theory more accountable. What do you think?
Yeah, I find Milei really entertaining, and I think he seems to be doing a good job for Argentina, which has a very different set of problems than the United States. And so I think, much like Singapore, like you really don't want to pattern match to this really extreme case. Like in Singapore, it's a case of like the entire country is basically New York City, and so there's a very different set of policies that work in New York versus what works in rural Alabama or something like that. And I think in Argentina's case, like the country has been a basket case for a really, really long time. And as people like to cite all the time, if you go back a little over a century ago, Argentina and the U.S. were neck and neck for highest GDP per capita in the world, and that's no longer the case. The U.S. and Argentina actually had kind of similar looking economies where there was this large natural resource and agriculture sector, which was enormously profitable, but that allowed them to attract a lot of really talented immigrants, and it gave them enough surplus, like economic surplus from their exports to start investing in more serious industry. And then the US handled that well. Argentina did not, and did end up with a system that just has has a lot of completely broken rules, has a lot of just pathological internal conflicts and things. And so in a case like that, like yeah, it is probably the case that in Argentina, like if you just start throwing rocks and setting fires in government offices, like you do actually fix more problems than you create. But in the US, we have a different set of equilibria where part of it is that you have a lot of companies that are trying to avoid legal liability, both because there's like the direct cost, but also there's the distraction of dealing with lawsuits and things. And sometimes having just a consistent set of rules, even if it's not the optimal set of rules, at least it means that you're not CCing a lawyer on every single thing you want to do and paying a lot of money for legal advice on whether or not this will work. Like regulators who create safe harbors for certain activities are doing a lot of good for the world. And so if we start getting rid of the people who do that, you could end up with a very messy transition to a less regulated system. Like I do have the same vibe that yeah, a lot of people don't seem to be doing things that are very useful. And whenever I've read a deep dive into how most US, like most federal bureaucracies work, like most of them seem like if you were designing this from scratch, you would have had a completely different approach, and a lot of these jobs would go away. There'd be a lot more automation. Like a lot more of the government should have APIs and should not be requiring physical pieces of paper to be passed around, and especially should not be paying people, like requiring physical papers to be mailed somewhere, paying someone to type them into a computer, and then analyzing them. Like you can skip a couple steps there and get a much more efficient outcome. On the other hand, those systems did evolve from simpler systems that worked a bit better. And so you want to be very cautious that as you destroy these things, that you don't destroy something important and load bearing. So I tend to think that you want to be maybe have, like if Milei has a flamethrower, you want to have a scalpel, and you want to start looking at very specific areas where you could deliver measurable improvements by reducing the regulatory burden on certain activities. And I think the place to start is you look at stated priorities the government has, and then you look at rules that directly interfere with those priorities. So if we want to decarbonize certain parts of the economy, but we also want to have a very lengthy permitting process for installing solar panels somewhere at scale, or transmitting that power somewhere else at scale, or building a nuclear power plant, but we don't have the same regulatory burden for keeping a coal power plant alive a little bit longer. I think that's a case where you want the incentives to push people to do on the margin what it is that we're actually trying to accomplish in the end. So I am a fan of more narrowly scoped reforms, but I also think that you get a lot of momentum if something like permitting for electrical generation, particularly focused on renewables and for transmission, if that got significantly cleaned up, accelerated a lot, and people realize that this leads to a direct increase in the amount of investment in these areas, that it leads to lower costs for consumers, leads to lower costs for businesses, and it actually leads to a less carbon intensive grid, then I think that starts to make the case for reforms in other places. But it is a big job. Like I think you should never trust anyone who looks at an organization the size of the federal government and says, based on the blog posts I've read and the tweets I've seen, I know exactly how to fix this and can get X% improvement in efficiency trivially. It may be true, but my guess is like the deeper you dig into it, the more you will find that It's just a difficult transition process. And also, there are just good public spirited people who do take the lower paying job offer. They go to DC and they do try to do a lot of good for their country. And if you're just blindly firing people, you will probably get a lot of those people too. And I think if you have like a reasonable model of any organization that is big enough that internal politics matters a lot and external outcomes matter less, then it's very likely that if you do start trying to fire people one at a time, that the people with a lot of political pull who are really good at making a case for keeping them are actually the ones you want to get rid of. And the people who are just quietly, putting together their spreadsheets, running their analyses, coming up with very sensible new rules or sensible interpretations of existing rules, like those people may not have the political capital to stick around. So I advise caution. I think you sort of want to be like 99% normal and 1% Milei, and then kind of titrate that up until you reach the point where you're a little too Milei, and then you pull back a little bit and kind of let things go.
Hey everybody, Erik here with a word from our sponsors. Fast forward to the end of 2024. Think about your goals. What can you do right now to give yourself the best chance of succeeding? If learning a new language is on your list, you absolutely need to check out Babbel. Babbel offers a range of learning tools, self-study app lessons, live classes, and even podcasts, which have always been my favorite way to learn. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel isn't just a game to kill time and make you feel like you're learning a language. It's not overly academic or rigid either. It's all about learning language for the real world. Babbel stands out because it's designed by real people using a modern conversational teaching approach. It's not always easy, nothing worth doing ever is, but it's straightforward and designed to help you start speaking in just 3 weeks. With Babbel, I was able to brush up on my intermediate Spanish to ramp up for travel to Argentina last year, and was able to set clear goals based on how much time each week I wanted to practice. Join millions of Babbel language learners across all age groups. Here's a special limited time offer for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners, at babbel.com/zen. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/zen, spelled BABBEL.com/zen. Rules and restrictions may apply. The tech world turns to the Brave browser for its unbeatable privacy protections. But did you know that Brave also has a private ad platform? Brave Ads offers first-party targeting, and it's been cookieless since day one, so you can relax while third-party tracking cookies disappear from the web. Today, millions of people turn to ad blockers to avoid being tracked and pestered online. But Brave's new ad model aligns incentives for users and advertisers. Users earn rewards for viewing ads, which they can save, spend, or pass along to their favorite creators. And advertisers score points for respecting user privacy, generating ROI without invasive tracking. So whether it's high-impact announcements on the new tab page or keyword-targeted ads in Brave Search offers diverse, private, future-proof ad formats for all your business goals. Join the future of advertising at brave.com/ads. Mention Turpentine to get 25% off your first campaign.
I want to segue to something else you wrote about, which is this idea of sort of consumer confidence, not necessarily always leading to financial downturns, or rather consumer defaults. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, so the idea there was, I think that anyone who experiences some kind of macroeconomic unpleasantness at a formative age, that tends to create a very strong imprint on them, and it tends to affect how they think about things in the future. So a lot of people who remembered the crash of 1929, they just felt like the stock market is a den of gamblers and you can't trust these companies and stocks always go down. There's this famous incident early in Warren Buffett's career, I want to say like 1951 or 1952, where his mentor, Ben Graham, he was talking to Graham about becoming a full-time professional investor. And Graham said, no, you shouldn't do that. The stock market, the Dow, is almost at the level that it was in 1929. And we know what happened last time the Dow hit 380 and change. It crashed. So stay out of the market. And the Dow never went below 380 again. So, and Graham was a really, really sharp guy, just, polymath, and had a good track record as an investor, et cetera. Like, he was not dumb, but he had been through some pretty bad times, and they left some scar tissue. And I think there's something similar with people whose formative economic experiences were in the 1970s, where inflation is out of control, where if you have cash in your bank account, you're earning 10% in theory, but actually the real value of that account is dropping. I guess that, I think at the time would have been if you had CDs, the actual accounts would yield less. But anyway, so for people like that, like inflation is just this universally disastrous outcome, and that it's always an asymmetric risk. Like it is way better if inflation's running at 2%, it's way better to risk 0% inflation than to risk 4% inflation. And the longer term track record is that that's really not true, that deflation does cause longer term problems than inflation, that hyperinflation does happen, but it's actually pretty rare, and very rare in the context of a country like the US, where we do have a large economy. We do have plenty of assets overseas, although we do owe plenty of money overseas too. But like the circumstances that lead to hyperinflation just don't really apply to the US. It would be a unique case if it were to happen. But a lot of people who just remember the value of a dollar declining precipitously in the 1970s, they still worry about that risk. And those people are not a huge fraction of the population these days, but they are a larger fraction of the electorate. So it is a lot easier for politicians to talk about the importance of a strong dollar and the importance of avoiding inflation than to talk about the obvious opposite risk of, if you constrain credit growth in an economy that is very heavily dependent on credit, then you're keeping growth low. And maybe like if you know that there is a current idiosyncratic risk of inflation, that might be exactly the right policy. But in general, it's not the main thing to worry about. And if you look at a chart of year-over-year CPI over the last few years, like you see some scary numbers, and then you see them getting a whole lot less scary. So even if it felt like we are actually, like, inflation's ramping up, we're going to hit this hyperinflation inflection point, you will want to spend your dollars as fast as you get them. You want to borrow everything you can and buy hard assets, buy gold, etc. Yeah, that did not turn out to be true. Like the part about buying gold, it did turn out to do okay for people, but the rest not so much. So
the harm of deflation is low growth, or the risk of deflation, is that basically it?
Yeah, like you can have an equilibrium where you just don't have a lot of credit creation in the economy, and you constrain that a bit. And to the extent that you have credit creation, it is very much tied to hard currency reserves. Like that is a system that does make a lot of sense and has a lot of internal coherence. What it typically leads to is you have more extreme boom and bust cycles, but you have they're oscillating around a more stable equilibrium. But if you have a system that does allow for large-scale credit creation, then it's just really hard to have that backed by some kind of hard currency setup. And as countries get richer, there tends to be this phenomenon where the value of real estate is going to go up non-linearly with respect to the size of the economy. It just the payoff of living in the right place gets higher and higher. And as that happens, there is this question of how do you finance the purchase of housing if someone is going to need a house as soon as they leave home, but they would have to work for decades in order to save up enough money to buy one for cash. So the solution that most countries have chosen to that is we're going to somewhat subsidize or encourage a market for mortgages. It's a very unnatural transaction to have the banking system financing mortgages because banks borrow short and a mortgage is a very long-term loan. But you can also view this as like a meta balanced system where if you have a country that is getting richer, it's also a country that's probably getting older. And if people are going to live for a longer period after they have retired or after they're no longer able to work, they need savings in the meantime. Those savings also have to be pretty long duration. So what you ideally get is a setup where the ratio of credit to GDP is expanding over time, but a big driver of that is people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s saving money, and then people in their 20s and early 30s borrowing money to buy houses. So that's actually a pretty healthy setup where if people's incomes are rising throughout their careers and like would typically peak in the mid 50s, you will have this point where you have a lot of people in middle age who they earn more money than they actually need to consume. They're earning more than their consumption baseline requires. And they also do need to start saving money because they don't really want to be working that hard at 75 or 85. And if they are saving that money is getting recycled into longer duration financial assets, which allow younger people to borrow money to buy homes in order to form families. Then you basically have money kind of cascading through the generations and keeping total fertility up, like keeping family formation high and not leading to any big interferences in that process. Now, if you didn't have that, if you were trying to constrain credit creation, what you would probably end up with is that housing prices would keep on rising. Younger people would have a hard time affording new homes, and so they'd be delaying family formation. And then you have a larger cohort cohort of older people who are trying to buy assets, but there aren't that many assets to buy in order for them to save. And so that ends up actually being net deflationary. Like if they are buying all of the long-term, long-duration assets, those assets, the yields start going down, but the risk hasn't really gone down very much. And so saving your money in cash or short-term government debt becomes a better and better deal. And at that point, if your marginal dollar is being earned by someone who's going to recycle it back into T-bills, that is a deflationary phenomenon. And at that point, if you have people who do have fixed obligations, like they did get a mortgage at some point, they did borrow money to buy a car, or they borrowed money to start their business or whatever, if price levels are declining, then the real value of that interest payment is going up over time. So that puts them in a really bad position. And so it is definitely not trivial to design a financial system from scratch. But if you are stuck with some kind of financial system that already exists, you can definitely have quibbles about exactly how it functions, and you can definitely imagine a much better system. But again, like the transition from a heavily credit-driven economy to like a hard money system where everything is backed by gold or everything is backed by Bitcoin is a very challenging one that would tend to involve a lot of wealth destruction and upheaval. And it's not clear that it would lead to a significantly better long-term outcome. It's good to have those reserve assets in existence. Like it's good for crypto to exist. It's good for gold to exist. But I think that the rule that they serve is just very different from the rule that they serve in an environment where governments just don't have the state capacity to tax highly enough to maintain the value of a fiat currency. Like you're still betting on the competence of these institutions, but it's kind of a bet that it's a bet you have to make. Like the scope of what can be done is a lot larger in a larger economy. And so the scope of things that the government does probably goes up in that economy and goes up disproportionately to the growth in the overall economy. But turning back to the consumer credit defaults question. So for me, the formative macro event of my life would have been the 2008 Great Financial Crisis. And I think for a lot of people around my age, that was also just a really big deal. And it either meant that we got a job and then we lost that job, or we graduated and it took a long time to find a job, or just no matter what happened, the early 2010s were just not a great time to be a new entrant into the workforce. Things got a lot better for younger people over time. And now millennials are on average ahead of other generations. But it was a struggle, and it was very salient. We had pop culture portrayals, so you've got things like The Big Short and Margin Call. Like people know the story, and one of the things they know about the story, which is true, is that one of the big causes of the financial crisis was lots of loans to consumers who could not afford to pay back those loans. They start defaulting. That starts causing wobbles elsewhere in the financial system, and pretty soon things just implode. And so if you're pattern matching to that, then when you heard a couple of weeks ago, Ally, which is a very large car lend, it's a bank, but they do a lot of car loans. They gave a presentation to investors. They said that defaults are actually a little bit worse than expected. I think the stock went down like 17% that day. And you might start to freak out. You might look at the total volume of auto loans out there and realize like this is actually a pretty big number, and it's kind of scary if the financial system is being threatened by this. And so when I was writing about this, what I wanted to point out was that one, just empirically, consumer credit defaults, like defaults on credit cards, defaults on cars, didn't really look at mortgages, but like defaults on those kinds of loans, they aren't that economically predictive of things like consumer sentiment. And there's a reason for that, which is that the banks, there's like a cycle to lending where when the economy is weak, you do want to make loans, but you want to make loans to very, very credit-worthy borrowers. So credit spreads tend to be very wide in recessions and when markets bottom. So like the spread between the interest you get on a safe loan and the interest you get on a really high-risk loan goes way up, and then that spread declines as the economy improves. So the way you want to think about it is that lenders are actually more willing to take default risk. Like they are embedding a higher expected default rate into the loans that they make when the economy is doing well. And that actually kind of makes sense from the lender's perspective. So if you are Capital One and you were considering whether or not to blast out new offers for a credit card with like you're giving people like $1,000 they can borrow on their Capital One card, and you're going to charge them an interest rate in the 20s, and maybe there'll be fees and things that make the effective interest rate higher than that. If you are doing that when the economy is actually growing, when unemployment is low, and you're sending these offers to pretty like less than prime customers, you know that it's actually a pretty good bet that your average customer is going to be more creditworthy a year or two from now than they are right now. That if unemployment was at 5 and it's ticking down, maybe a year from now it's at 4.5. So we're thinking like a couple years in the past. Like if unemployment goes from 5 to 4.5, then a lot of the borrowers who are marginally employed, now they're in a position where they can actually pay back those loans. And you as Capital One, you didn't have to pay as much money to acquire those customers when nobody wanted them than you have to pay now when everybody wants them. So if you are a lender and you're lending to less than prime borrowers, you actually get more excited when the economy is growing and it's rational for you to do so. Like those are the customers you want. They will get more prime over time and you will be able to sell them a lot more other services when their credit limit is $10,000 or $50,000 instead of $1,000, and when they have actually reliably paid things back. And meanwhile, as they're spending more, you're getting more data, you have more information from marketing other things to them. Maybe in a couple of years, they have gone from marginally employed to an upstanding member of the middle class. They've saved some money. Now they want to buy a house. And who are they going to talk to? Is it some random bank they never heard of? Or is it the first bank that ever lent them any money? Probably that first bank is at the head of the line. And if mortgages are a commodity product, then, and they are, you're just not going to see that much differentiation in rates if you have a normal W-2 job and can actually afford the house. In that case, probably they win that customer, and their cost of getting that lead and actually getting that mortgage is a whole lot higher than their initial cost was of getting that credit card into the hands of someone who was a potential borrower. So you should expect it to be true that defaults actually tick up when the economy has been doing well for a while, because it means that lenders are actually comfortable lending to some people who are going to default, knowing that some of them will actually their credit situation will improve. And what's really fun is if you run a regression and you look at, okay, how do defaults predict future consumer sentiment, you find that like the shape of the graph is pretty much okay, but there are some weird blips. And one of those weird blips is that consumer sentiment, there were times in the 2010s where consumer sentiment was pretty good because the economy was actually improving, but defaults had not ticked up because the loan book was going to be weighted to loans that had been made when the economy was a bit worse and when credit standards were more stringent. And then in the inflationary episode, you actually have the opposite. You have consumer sentiment looking really, really bad, but default rates actually looking okay. And if you think about it, inflationary periods are the time when people would actually feel like a lot worse, like the people who are kind of economically marginal, like call it 40th percentile earners and below, they notice when they go to the grocery store that the things they bought a year ago are more expensive than before. And they anchor, when they think about inflation, they think about what was the most shocking price increase they saw. And that is like the everyday man CPI is what thing that I buy regularly has gone up the most in price. And so they feel like, yeah, I'm worse off. And then when one of the drivers of that inflation is that people in their wage bracket have actually been getting larger raises than people elsewhere in the economy, that feels a little more like they earned it. And in some sense they did. Like I do think that the bottom quintile was pretty underpaid in the 2010s because the economy wasn't growing fast and companies could afford not to pay them all that much. And so they were sort of getting this long promised participation in American economic growth. And so they were sort of right to feel like, yeah, I wasn't worth $12 an hour. I was in fact worth $20 an hour, and I'm glad I'm finally getting that money. So that part of inflation does feel like that's just normal and just. But the part where the gallon of milk has gone up in price, the eggs have gone up in price, that feels weird. And then the payment they're making on their car, that just isn't as salient. Like it's just a number that is baked into their model of how much they spend in a given month. So the fact that in real terms, their car payment is actually going down when inflation goes up, that's just less visible than the fact that the milk and eggs have gone up.
No, that's a good explanation. I want to segue to other posts you wrote. You wrote twice about private equity this past week. First, in that there was a sort of a vehicle that expands access to it, to sort of an ETF of sorts, and then also there was this idea that you wrote about that just PE has evolved a bit, or there may be more uses than we thought. Why don't you unpack some of this?
Yeah, so you can look at early PE as basically one big trade. And the trade was equities have gone way down in price, and there's been enough inflation that the real assets backing those equities have actually gone up in value. And if we think that inflation is going to be running fairly hot for a while, we can borrow money. We know that the real rates are not that high. We can buy really cheap assets. We can sell them to someone who cares, someone who can value them right, or we can somewhat fix up these companies, but mostly take advantage of the fact that if you're paying 18% for your money, but you're buying things at 5 times earnings and those earnings are going up, you tend to do pretty well as long as there isn't a big recession right after you bought or something. And over time, PE, like for one thing, they used to use just insane amounts of leverage. It used to be like 10 to 1 was kind of the working assumption a lot of people had, but there were deals where it was like $1 million in equity and 79 million in bank debt. And we don't really get to do that anymore, which is a tragedy. It'd be so much fun. Now, like 50-50 is kind of a reasonable working assumption. So you are levering up the company, but you're not levering it up a ton. But I think the other observation they had was, look, there's a cycle to financial assets. And if everyone knows that borrow, like sell bonds, buy equity is the trade, everyone's going to do the trade. And at some point, if everyone's selling bonds and everyone's buying stocks, then you want to be in the business of selling stocks and buying bonds instead. And so they did start to diversify out of just purely, we're going to buy stuff, we're going to lever up, buy stuff and fix it and sell it, or just sell it, to we're going to be financial intermediaries. We're going to be sophisticated about where in the capital structure we can add value, where we have expertise. If they've been negotiating lots and lots of bond deals from the side of the borrower over time, they probably have a pretty good idea of what market rates are and of how lenders think. And they've probably looked at smart lenders, dumb lenders, learned what they can from the smart ones, learned to take advantage of the dumb ones. And at some point, they just have enough experience that they can be the smart money in that market. And that gives them a little bit of a hedge. So a lot of these firms have slowly evolved from being these pure investment vehicles to being a different kind of investment bank. And one piece of that was they did start to realize that it's just a lot easier to do a business like this if you have access to stable capital that you know is going to be there for a long time. And there are some sources of stable capital. And you really, if you want a lot of capital and you want a lot of leverage, you want to be a bank. But if you have any criterion other than just maxing out leverage, you do not want to be a bank. You don't want to be regulated as one. You have a lot of constraints on that. You don't want to be someone who is a systemically important institution, et cetera. You don't want that. But there are corners of the insurance business that do have attractive leverage characteristics and that do get access to capital for a really long time, one of which is life insurance. So some of them have adopted their model where the entity that is doing a lot of the lending, the entity that supplies this balance sheet that they can use to make intelligent investments in credit, is a life insurance company, and the liabilities are very predictable. They're very long-term. So you can run a matched book where you're making long-term loans, you're buying long-term bonds, but you're buying that with capital that has also a very long duration, because the customers are people who are in their 40s and 50s buying life insurance policies and annuities, and those are going to be paying out decades in the future. And if you're big, you know pretty much when. So they have slowly started creeping into other parts of the market. So it used to be that private equity deals were very much, you issue low-rated bonds, and those bonds would carry very high interest rates, but the plan was liquidate a lot of stuff fast so you don't spend that much time paying really high rates. Now, as they've gotten less levered and as they've gotten better at buying companies that have pretty durable and predictable cash flows, those credit ratings have in many cases come up, but also they've started moving into the business of making investment grade loans to companies, because again, they know that if you're really good at understanding the capital structure, you don't always want to be the buyer of some particular asset class, and you don't always want to be the seller. You want to be the buyer when it's cheap, and you want to be the seller when it's expensive. And you want to have enough of a balance sheet that you can do all of that. So it's been an interesting evolution to watch. I think people in the banking space are kind of annoyed, because you could sort of, when you look at the really important and highly levered financial institutions circa 2007, you have investment banks and you have hedge funds and you have private equity. Hedge funds just were not really a systemic risk. To the extent that they're a systemic risk, it's macro funds that are doing more mean reversion-y stuff, or systemic risks to small developing countries, but not really to the US. PE didn't really pose systemic risks because they were like the equity investors were risk-seeking, and the lenders were also risk-seeking. It was the investment banks where a lot of people treated them as very, very creditworthy. They were just less stable than it really looked like. Some of them were, in effect, prop trading firms that were levered 30 to 1, trading lots of really illiquid assets. So it was, of course, a disaster. So the banks ended up becoming a lot closer to a traditional banking model. They don't really get to do prop trading. They can sort of, they're not allowed to do prop trading. There are things that have a lot of the flavor of prop trading that they are still able to do, but it's definitely not as wild as it was in 2007. But the PE firms have ended up moving closer to the economic niche that someone like Goldman or Lehman or Merrill Lynch would have occupied in the mid 2000s, where they can intermediate. Sometimes they're finding somebody else's capital. Sometimes they're using their own capital. They can run with some leverage. They're not running with as much leverage as those entities were, as those banks were. And it is a little more contained at the level of individual companies, individual funds, et cetera. But it is a useful niche to have financial intermediaries who find someone who wants to lend long, find someone who wants to borrow long, connect the two, click, repeat. So I think it's been an interesting evolution. I think part of what it tells you is that there was, in one sense, a regulatory overreaction after the crisis, where we made the banks lame, we made them utilities. They're not going to fail, probably, hopefully. I don't think they'll fail. I don't think any of the big investment banks will fail in my lifetime. But yeah, maybe at some point something will change, and they will. But so in one sense, we told them to stop doing this thing, and then that thing turned out to be an economically valuable, very profitable thing that PE firms have increasingly moved into. But on another level, maybe that just tells you markets are actually pretty adaptable to regulatory overreach. And as long as you're regulating and punishing particular entities that were actually run pretty irresponsibly in the 2000s, as long as you tell them to stop, but you don't ban the activities that they were engaged in, someone else will find a way to do those activities. And of course, like the people who are at the front lines of these companies, they all read Too Big to Fail. They all watched The Big Short and Margin Call. They loved them. And so they also know that if you are making these long-term investments in extremely illiquid fixed income assets, you don't want to fund it with just overnight borrowing. You want to actually have your funding locked in. You don't want to be the person getting the margin call. You want to be the person doing the margin call and getting somebody else's assets on the cheap. So I think it is a net happy ending, although a lot of people in that story do end up frustrated.
Yeah. Gearing towards closing here, I want to make sure we get to one last topic you wrote about, which is online reputation management.
Yeah. I love this one.
Yeah. So when do you get into that?
Okay. So if you have a job or a hobby that causes you to periodically Google people and just try to find out what their deal is. Maybe you are researching companies that you want to invest in. Maybe you are a hiring manager, you're looking to employees. You will sometimes find a set of search results where this person just has like a lot of profiles on a lot of places. And some of these profiles seem kind of skimpy. Like they have a personal blog on WordPress, but they also have a personal blog on Tumblr. Each of those blogs has 3 posts. The posts are really boring. They also have a charity, but the charity doesn't seem to be like a registered charity of any kind. It's just like something.org that has a prominent biography of them on it. And you might be kind of confused about that. Like this person is not famous enough to have this big an online footprint, and also their online footprint doesn't look like a normal online footprint. What is probably the case is that if you click to the next page of the search results, you will find some kind of scandalous story about them. And it's often not like a hugely disastrous story. And the reason that this happens is that there is this business called online reputation management, which sells the service of, if you have some negative story about you on page 1 of Google, you pay someone to push that story off of page 1. And in a lot of cases, it's either like someone was mad at you and wrote a blog post about how much they hate you, or you were someone's manager and they wrote a scathing Glassdoor review that mentions you by name. You just don't want that out there. You recognize that it is one person who happened to be very angry, and their content is just indelibly on the internet. There are people who try to use online reputation management to hide really, really scandalous stuff, but it tends not to work. Like the stuff they're trying to hide, Google recognizes that it's quite interesting and quite relevant to them, so it's very hard to push it off the front page. And then there's a more aggressive and shady version of this, which my understanding is that this used to be a common tactic and has gotten harder to execute over time. But the old hyper aggressive online reputation management tactic was, you take the text of whatever the thing online is that you want to get rid of. You create a fake website for a fake news publication. You just copy a bunch of content from other news publications, but you also copy this article, you backdate it, and then you send the host of whatever company, like the host of the site that has the article you want to get to take it down, you send them a DMCA takedown notice. You say, this is plagiarism, this is my content, you are pirating it. And in a lot of cases, people will just default to taking it down rather than dealing with the legal troubles. So that ecosystem, like I have seen it in a couple of cases, just researching people involved in fraudulent companies or semi-fraudulent companies, and it shows up in a few other cases. And I think in a lot of cases, it is kind of benign, because we exist in an information environment where a lot of our instincts are really, really good for being in a small community where we know everyone and everything is an iterated game. So gossip is really important and really valuable. Like if someone is untrustworthy and they're one of the 100 people you will spend the rest of your life with, you really want to know what they did. And, they will be able to make amends because everyone knows about it and everyone's going to be mad at them until they try to make up for it or until they leave. But the internet is that village, except it has 8 billion people in it, or not quite 8 billion, but it has many billions of people in it. And so that same gossip is just like massively magnified in terms of its impact. And our reaction to it is also just wildly out of proportion to just how likely it is that there would be a negative story about that someone would say something negative about someone else on the internet. So in some ways, online reputation management is a free market response to this phenomenon that our social instincts are not designed for the internet. It's also like a privatized version of the EU's right to be forgotten, where their idea was if you have those kinds of search results and you're really just embarrassed that they exist online, you can just have search engines take them down. So the content's still going to be out there. People will still be able to find it if they know what they're looking for, but people who don't know what they're looking for won't be able to find it. And I don't know that there's a better or worse solution there. Like probably realistically what happens over time is just it gets really hard to bury stuff. And everyone has some kind of skeletons in their closet. And then if someone doesn't, you just kind of assume that they did something really, really bad that they took great pains to get away with. And maybe that's the healthy equilibrium we end up with. But it's going to take a long time for just human social instincts to adapt to that.
Yeah. And with that, we're right at the hour. So let's call it Byrne. As always, a great discussion. And until next time.
Yes, indeed. All right. Good times.
Thanks for listening to The Riff. Please go follow and subscribe, give us 5 stars, and check out Byrne's excellent newsletter, The Diff, if you haven't already.